How many rules for conditionals in English do you know? If you know the 60 different rules for conditionals that I'm going to share in this video, then your English is fantastic. And there's a free PDF with all 60 rules. You can get it through a link in the description. But let's begin with the first conditional. We'll start with the basic uses, then move to the advanced uses, and we're going to do this through the topic of being in an audience. So the basic rules for the first conditional are that you use if, followed by the present simple, and then a clause with will. Look at the example in green. If they arrive for the lecture early, they will get a seat near the front. If with the present simple, if they arrive, and then a clause with will, they will get. And this suggests a present or future consequence of a condition. The condition is that they arrive early, and the consequence or the outcome of that is they will get a seat near the front. So they need to do one thing for another thing to happen. And that's what conditionals are all about. Another way of saying this that's similar is to include then before the will clause. The word then makes it clearer that one thing depends on another. But now let's go into some more advanced uses of the first condition. One advanced use of the first conditional is to place will in the if clause. Now hold on, you may have been taught that you never put will in the if clause, but sometimes you do. Look at the example in green. If you will benefit from my assistance, I will help you with your work. And here what's happened is the condition in the if clause is a result of the second clause. So if still introduces the condition, if you will benefit from my assistance, but the condition is that there's a result from the consequence. I will help you with your work, and that leads to benefit from my assistance. And if this is a situation where the condition actually contains the result too, then we can place will in the if clause in this way. Another reason we'll put will in the if clause is for polite requests. If you will sign the register, we will let you join the class. So here normally we would say if you sign the register, but to indicate it's a polite request we can use will. Later on in this lesson we'll see that you can use would as well. Now so far we've only looked at conditionals with will, but we can use other modals too, such as might or could. If we run as fast as possible, we might catch the train, which you can see on the screen below. Now, why would we use might or could? Well, will indicates quite a high level of certainty in the consequence happening after the condition. But might reduces that certainty. So now it's a possible consequence, not a certain consequence. If we run as fast as possible, we might catch the train. It's possible to catch the train, but of course we might miss it as well. We can also use must. Now here we introduce something which is necessary as a condition. If you want to catch the train, you must arrive on time. To fulfill the condition, you must do something necessary. You can also use can. With can, fulfilling the condition leads to ability or a possibility becoming available. If we buy tickets for the sleeper carriage, we can sleep on the train. So here the consequence is not certain, it's just that the possibility is now opened up. It now becomes available because we fulfilled the condition. We bought the tickets for the sleeper carriage, now we have the ability to do what that enabled us to do, sleep on the train. And we can use should, and this introduces a consequence in the form of advice. If you want to get a seat on the train, you should travel at quiet times. So here the consequence is advice, not a certainty. Now there's something interesting about must and should with the first conditional, because sometimes must and should move the condition to the second clause. This is what happened in the example that we just looked at. If you want to get a seat on a train, you should travel at quiet times. Now, here, the condition is travel at quiet times, the part with should. The consequence comes in the if part, get a seat. You could actually have said, if you travel at quiet times, you will get a seat. But in this special situation, when you're talking about your needs or wants or wishes, and you use should in the second clause, the order actually gets reversed. So the condition comes with the should part or the must part. However, in other situations, the normal first conditional rules apply. If you go to London, you should visit Big Ben. Here, the order is normal. Go to London is the condition. If that condition is met, then the following can happen. You should visit Big Ben. Now, there are lots of other first conditional rules too, and we're going to call them all advanced. So let's look at them one by one. Firstly, if with a past simple clause and then a clause with will. Now again, you may say, surely the past simple with if is the second conditional. Not here. If using a past situation to describe a likely future consequence, it is possible to use the past tense in the if clause. Now study this example. The examples in this part of the video are all going to be based on clothes or making clothes. So let's look at it. If the factory didn't use high quality materials when making your shirt, it will wear out quickly. So here, didn't use refers to a past situation. So the past situation was the condition affecting the consequence later. It's as if we don't know what happened in the past here, but we are imagining the consequences of the past relating to the present. So if this didn't happen in the past, we're not sure about it, but we're thinking maybe it didn't. So if it didn't, then this present situation will be true as a consequence. So it has the qualities of the first conditional because this is a real situation. It's just that the condition is something in the past and we don't actually know whether that condition was fulfilled or not. Another first conditional rule is we're using going to instead of will. Now, why would you use going to instead of will? Well, this is for a pre-planned consequence. If the materials arrive on time, I'm going to make socks tomorrow. Now, why going to here? It's because the plan already exists. The plan exists to make the socks. But there is one condition that needs to be fulfilled before that plan can be confirmed. So to emphasize, it's a plan and not just a consequence of the condition that we'll use going to. Now, you could have used will here as well, but going to is useful to say, I've already planned this, because that's why we use going to sometimes for the future. Another conditional rule is using should followed by an imperative clause. Look at the example at the bottom. If you should find the buttons, tell me so I can repair my coat. So if you should, if subject and then should. And then the imperative clause is where we put the verb at the beginning to give an instruction. Tell me. So this structure is used, looking at the words in black now, this structure is used when something probably won't happen, but you state the condition in case it does. It's interesting that should doesn't have anything to do with advice here. Should here indicates the condition is unlikely but might happen. So keep watching, keep looking. If you find the buttons, tell me. If you should find the buttons, tell me. Should indicates that you are looking out for something to happen that may not happen in this case. Variations on this structure include using happen to, which really works in the same way. If you happen to find the buttons, tell me so I can repair my coat. And also should happen to. There's no change in meaning. It's just words that some people use for the same thing. If you should happen to find the buttons, tell me so I can repair my coat. The previous example only had should, but now we've added in the extra part, should happen to. So if I should, if you should, if I happen to, if you happen to, if I should happen to, if you should happen to, all do the same thing. In certain situations, we can omit key words from the first conditional, such as if. In very informal situations, where using an if sentence to give quick instructions, we might omit if altogether, which means leave it out. You want to finish early? Work harder. But be aware, you may have noticed that the tone perhaps wasn't the friendliest, and that's true. So here's a warning. Omitting if to give a quick informal instruction can sound impatient, insistent, and possibly rude. So while it's a grammatical possibility, be careful when using it. And if you hear it, you've probably heard some annoyance as well from the speaker. Another way we can omit words is by omitting the subject followed by the verb to be. This could be used when giving very formal or official instructions. The imperative is sometimes used in the second clause instead of a structure with will, as in the example here. If told to leave, do so immediately. This is short for if you are told to leave, do so immediately. But to make it more formal, more official sounding, more like a command with authority, we've left out the subject and to be. Let's go on to using the word when. When is going to come up more when we look at the zero conditional. But sometimes it can be used in place of if, and there isn't much change in the meaning at all. And in this particular case, when we omit the subject and to be, that's the case. So if we say when told to leave, do so immediately. There's not much difference to saying if told to leave, except that when indicates there's a very strong likelihood that something will take place. If is simply saying the time that it takes place, do this, but I'm not saying that I'm certain it will happen. Before we go on to the zero conditional, let me tell you about a course that I have called the Perfect English Grammar Course, which will expand your knowledge of grammar far further than I can do with this video. This course has over 40 hours of videos and 600 individual videos from me, all aimed to get your English level to the highest possible. There's a link in the description to this video below. Let's move on to the zero conditional then. First of all, we're going to look at the basic uses, and now our theme has changed. We're moving from summer to autumn and into winter here. So for the most basic use, we have if followed by a present simple clause and then another present simple clause here, not a will clause. Look at the example and then we'll look at the explanation. So the example's in green. If the weather turns cold, people don't go out in this town. In autumn, that's what happens. The weather goes cold. Here, if is used for things that will possibly happen and always lead to the same consequence. And that's the key difference here. By using the present simple in the second clause as well, we're indicating to our reader or listener that the condition always leads to the same consequence. So what we mean here is every time the weather turns cold, the consequence will be the same also every time. People don't go out. It's a natural reaction to the situation. But we could also use when as well. Now, why would we use when instead of if? Well, we use this structure for things that will definitely happen and will always lead to the same consequence. So when autumn arrives, the leaves on many trees turn brown. But we used when instead of if here because autumn always arrives. It's certain. It's not just a possibility. When I said, if it turns cold, I don't know if it's going to turn cold or not. But I'm just saying that should this be true, then the next consequence happens. When is different. When is something that will definitely happen. There's no doubt about it. When autumn arrives, of course, it will arrive. As with the first conditional, when clauses can be followed by a range of modals leading to different meanings. The key difference is that a when clause represents something that is guaranteed to happen. The modals don't change that, but they still introduce a new element of meaning. Let's look at a few here. When you get home, you must keep quiet. So in this case, we are certain that the person is going to get home. Perhaps they've just called you and they said they're 2 minutes away from being home. They're going to walk through the door any second. So we don't need to say if, because we know it's going to happen. So we use when. When you get home, but here's what the consequence should be. So it's something necessary as a result. You must keep quiet. Must showing necessity. Might can be used as well. When you get home, I might be asleep. So one definite thing that's going to happen, get home. One possible thing that you'll discover on arrival, I might be asleep. Can, again, can be used when you get home. You can eat anything you find in the fridge. So you have some ability if this condition is met. And you should take your shoes off immediately. So there's some advice for you the moment that this happens. Rule 38 doesn't fit neatly into any of the conditionals, 0, first, second or third. If you must is a phrase all on its own, but we can use it as a condition. And this means a reluctant concession to someone else's wishes, or it could mean if it is entirely necessary, as in the example in red. I don't want you to go out at night, but if you must, please be careful. So here, if you must indicates that there is reluctance, but an acceptance that it might happen. So if the following thing has to happen, if it's entirely necessary, then please make sure the next thing happens. If you must. Now let's look at something called the second conditional, starting with the basic uses before we go on to the advanced. And the topic here is having enough money to buy a car. Here is the main second conditional structure. If followed by a past simple clause and then a clause with would. If I earned a lot of money, I would buy a bigger car. So here we have if I earned, if with a past simple clause, and then I would buy, a clause with would. And this does the following. It introduces a condition, if I earned a lot of money, leading to a present or future consequence, I would buy a bigger car. But the difference to the first conditional is this is a situation that is imaginary. It's very unlikely to happen in real life. So the person saying this doesn't think they're going to earn a lot of money. They're just imagining it. Now, with the second conditional, something happens to the verb to be that doesn't happen in many other situations. And that is we can use were when we would normally use was. If I were rich, I would choose to buy a fast car. So it is common to use were after these subjects, I or he or she or it, instead of was, when we normally would use was for the past simple of the verb to be. Now let's go on to advanced uses. Now sometimes this structure doesn't get followed by would, but it could get followed by a question. And this is one reason why. Look at the words in green first. If you were in my city last week, why didn't you visit me? So the structure is used here to mean if something is true, I have a related question. If you were in my city last week, the related question, why didn't you visit me? Now we often use this when we're talking about something that did happen in the past. It is often used when a person did something. But the second person doesn't understand why this didn't lead to a particular consequence. So the person speaking has heard that their friend was, or they thought it was their friend. They heard that their friend was in their city last week. Perhaps someone told them. And that made them think, why didn't that lead to this consequence? Why didn't that person visit me? Why didn't this situation lead to another outcome? Another advanced use of the second conditional is when we put would into the if clause. Now, sometimes in informal conversational English, people use would in the if clause too. If you would earn a lot of money, would you buy a bigger car? Now, grammatically, many grammar books will tell you this is not correct. I'm simply including this in the video because it has slipped into English usage quite a lot. So it's worth knowing that people use it. But when you're writing, I suggest you stick to the old rules. Now, this also happens more commonly when we are making requests more formal or polite sounding. And there's a use of would to make everything more polite. And this is more valid and more accepted by grammar books. So the example here, I would prefer it if you would drive more slowly. Here the if clause comes second and the other clause comes first. But instead of saying if you drive more slowly or if you drove more slowly, by saying would drive, we're making it more polite. Would being that word that can make things more polite. Now, sometimes the clause after if in the past simple contains should, and this represents advice based on a hypothetical situation. For example, if you were paid $10,000 to do a parachute jump, you should do it. Now, what about you? What do you think? How much would I need to pay you to do a parachute jump? But here we're giving advice to someone. They offered you $10,000. You should do it. So should replaces would here because it requires advice instead. It's still an unlikely situation. It's still an imaginary situation, but the person is imagining the advice they would give if the condition was met, however unlikely. Now, might can be used too. If I were paid $20,000 to jump out of a plane, I might do it. So here we're saying that the consequence is possible, not certain. But it's still an unlikely situation because I don't think someone's going to pay me $20,000 to do it. Now, before we go on, let me mention that although should and might are used commonly in second conditional structures, other modals less so. So we saw in the first conditional and the zero conditional, we used words such as must as well. Less likely in the second conditional. But one other thing we can do is use will in the second clause instead of would. So there is this structure here, if followed by a clause with would and then a clause with will. And this is usually used when making a polite request with a promise of what happens if the request is granted. If you would let me do a parachute jump, so this is polite, then the following, I will donate to charity. Here, would does not indicate something being hypothetical. This is a real request. You're actually asking someone about a real situation. Please let me do this. I will do that. And sometimes we can use were to in the if clause and then the clause followed with would in the second clause. And this introduces a future hypothetical activity. If you were to jump out of a plane, your parents would be terrified. Would your parents be terrified? So again, it's still hypothetical, but it's placing it in the future. If you were to, this structure indicates something not present, but something coming up after. And there's more advanced uses of the second conditional still. You can use would it followed by the if part with a past simple clause. Would it be okay if I change my mind about the parachute jump. Maybe that would happen to you. If you get into the plane, some people, when they get into the plane, finally decide they don't want to do a parachute jump at all. Now, this is a polite way of asking if you can or can't do a certain activity. You front it, which means put the words at the beginning with would it. And it's normally would it be something? Would it be acceptable? Would it be possible? Would it be okay? But for is often used to introduce the only reason why a situation did not happen. But for the storms, we would have jumped out of a plane today. The storms were the only reason why this did not happen. And if it wasn't for is similar to but for, but it's often used to introduce something that saved a situation from a bad consequence. If it wasn't for John, I would never have fulfilled my ambitions to jump out of a plane. John obviously persuaded me. John helped me get used to the idea. John reassured me. And so I did it. But John was the only reason. If it wasn't for John, no, I would never have fulfilled my ambitions. So let's leave the second conditional behind, and now let's go on to the third conditional. And we're going to use the topic of a failed exam. First of all, the basic use of the third conditional. The structure in the basic use is as follows. If followed by a past perfect clause, then in the second clause, a clause with would have and the past participle. And this looks back at past situations and imagines how they might have been different. If I had studied harder, I would have passed my exams. Have you ever been in that situation? It's not now, it's in the past. The exams are in the past, you failed, and you're thinking, I should have done something else. Now, although this structure usually refers to a past consequence in the second clause, it can also refer to a present or future consequence if the context allows. Study this example here. If I had studied harder, I would have reached a higher level by now. So something happened in the past. I didn't study hard. And that past situation meant there was actually a present consequence. I'm not at the level I should be. Now let's go on to advanced uses. Now, sometimes we can use would be in the second clause instead of would have and the past participle. So this is an alternative to what we just saw before about a past situation having a present or future consequence. If I had studied harder, I would be studying at a higher level. So here it's would be studying, not would have been or would have studied. So we're still imagining things. We're still imagining the past. We're still thinking, I didn't study hard enough in the past. Could things have been different? Well, if I had studied harder, if things were different in the past, then here's the consequence. But the consequence is now a present one. I would be studying at a higher level now. Sometimes we could use could have with the past participle instead of would have. Now here it introduces a possible consequence. Had a certain situation been different in the past? If I had revised every day, I could have passed my exams. Now might can be used instead of could here. If I had revised every day, I could have passed my exams. But again, must and should are uncommon in the third conditional. Let's go on to short forms with if. We can use this short phrase, if anything, followed by a clause. Now, if anything is an adverbial, and this introduces a clause meaning the following. If there is any possibility of the previous thing being true, then this should happen instead. Study the example closely. It's split into two sentences here. I don't think I should invite her to dinner. If anything, she should invite me. So if anything introduces the truth of the situation. Considering what was in the sentence before, well, I don't think that's true. If anything, well, that introduces what should happen instead. If anything, she should invite me. Another short form of if is if so, and this simply links a consequence back to a condition in the previous sentence. Why don't you see if you can get some time off next Friday? If so, we can accept your mother's invitation. So try to get time off next Friday. Let's see if you're successful. If so means if you are successful with this. If you are successful, here is the potential consequence or result or something that becomes possible. We can accept your mother's invitation. If not is also used in a number of ways, and this is a consequence of a condition in the previous sentence not being fulfilled. Why don't you see if you can get some time off next Friday? If not, ask for a day off at the weekend. So if not suggests that the condition in the sentence before is not fulfilled, and therefore you have to take a different course of action. Now, if not can also be used to introduce an intensification like this. Often, if not always, she invites us to her birthday party. What does that mean here? Well, often she invites us to her birthday party, but if I've got it wrong about being often, then actually it's more rather than less. So I'm intensifying the often. When I'm saying often, I probably mean more than often. Often, if not always, it intensifies the often. Sometimes we can invert structures when we're talking about conditionals. Sometimes this causes if to disappear. In the first example, look at the words in green first. Were I to spend time with my son, I would play games with him. Now, this is a second conditional structure, but the word if has gone and the subject and verb have swapped places. Not if I were, but just were I. And this is an alternative to if I were for the second conditional. It's followed by either to plus a verb or an adjective or a noun phrase. But it's still got the same hypothetical second conditional meaning and would in the second clause. With the third conditional, instead of saying if I had, I could say had plus I. So we have a clause starting with had and the subject. And then in the second clause, we still have the same, would have in the past participle. Had I spent more time with my son, I would have played games with him. Another form of inversion happens with the word should, and this time it represents the first conditional. Should there be no school today, I will take my son to the park. So instead of using if here, we invert the structure, but should goes at the beginning. Several structures are possible with if only. Firstly, if only with a past tense clause. Now, this actually introduces a desire for something to be different in the present, similar to the second conditional. If only the weather was better. I'm meaning now. If we use a clause with would, then this indicates a desire for something to be different in the future. If only it would stop raining. So from this moment onwards, I want it to stop raining. If you use a past perfect clause, this is when you look back to the past and wish that the outcome of something was different to the reality. If only it had been a sunny day yesterday. There are many alternative words that you can use in the place of if as well. Supposing is one of those. This is similar to if in the first clause, but it often leads to a question in the second clause. For example, looking at the food here, we have this worry. Supposing the delivery of the food for the lunch is late, how will we feed all of our guests? We can also use the word imagine. This can turn an if clause into an independent sentence. Imagine if everyone had enough food. All charities would close. So we still have if here, but after the word imagine, it becomes a sentence on its own. But sometimes we can use imagine to introduce a hypothetical situation without if as well. Imagine life in an igloo. What's an igloo? It's that snow house that is in a kind of a circle that people build in cold places where there's snow. But imagine life in an igloo, in a snow house. It would be challenging for someone who comes from a hot country to cook in it. So here we don't use if at all. We're just imagining a situation and then responding to it. Provided that, or providing, both introduce a unique condition for the consequential clause, and it's often used as a first conditional. Provided that the food has been cooked thoroughly, it will be safe. So provided that this condition needs to be met, and then the consequence will be true. And on condition that means that the second clause can only be fulfilled after the first condition is also fulfilled. On condition that you get qualified, you can work as our cook. So here, we're offering someone the opportunity to cook our food. Perhaps as an employment, you could be the cook for the restaurant. But there's one condition. You must fulfill this condition. Get qualified. So long as is similar. So long as you get qualified, you can become our cook. There's one thing you need to do, and then the next part can be fulfilled. What if introduces a one-sentence hypothetical question about a condition? What if the food doesn't arrive? What would we do next? And now for some final bits. Here's some things not to forget. Remember that the order of clauses in a conditional can usually be reversed. So if you say, if you speak, I will answer, you could switch it around. I will answer if you speak. For the common uses of the first conditional, second conditional, third conditional, zero conditional, that can always happen. But there were some structures in them which were more advanced uses where you could not, particularly if they're not full clauses. Will, would and had can be contracted informally to apostrophe LL or apostrophe D. Would and had both contract to apostrophe D, so you have to use the rest of the context of the sentence to know which one it is. If you speak, I'll answer. Now for a few more final bits that will just finish off your knowledge of the conditionals. We could use an imperative clause before an if or when clause. We can do this in these ways. Answer him if he speaks. Remember, the imperative is an instruction where we put the verb at the beginning before putting anything to do with anyone else. We don't include the subject. We simply put the verb and it's an instruction. Answer him if he speaks. That's present. Ask him if he will come to dinner. So the will indicates future here. And listen to him when he speaks. And the word when indicates always do this. Unless can introduce a conditional meaning except if. Unless you listen to the speaker, you won't know the answer. Let's turn that around. You won't know the answer, but there's one reason that this would be different. You listen to the speaker. So unless introduces this one reason why that consequence would be different. Even if introduces a conditional with the sense that doing something won't enable the condition to be fulfilled. Even if you read all of the books, you won't learn what the lecturer can tell you. So even if says you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. You can do as much of this particular situation, read all the books, as you like. It still won't affect the next condition. You won't learn what the lecturer can tell you.